In the first video on religion, we looked at the development of American religion from pre-colonization through the American in the end of the colonial period. And in this second video, we're going to talk about everything from the American Revolution through the Antebellum age. And I want to start with the idea of the Enlightenment, which was mentioned in last video. The Enlightenment, not surprisingly, weakened the divine right of kings. Kings would say, well, you got to follow me because God picked me, and it's God's desire that you follow me. Of course, if God doesn't deal in just creates natural laws and doesn't deal with decisions like who's king, then it begs the question of, well, why are there kings, and why should I as a subject even obey you? And so the Enlightenment's going to prove a key motive for the American Revolution. The Great Awakening, which I mentioned last time, was a reaction to the Enlightenment. That also moved people to revolution. But generally, it moved the less educated lower classes to revolution by stressing that God cared about all people and all people were equal in God's eyes. That you were just as important as the king. So the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, the reaction to the Enlightenment was the Great Awakening, they both moved Americans towards the revolution. You can see this in America's Declaration of Independence. It reflected Enlightenment ideals. It spoke of the laws of nature and nature's God. Never did it mention any specific religion or any specific God. But clearly God was important to the Founding Fathers. The chaplains traveled with the American Army, and Washington wanted his army units to have chaplains. It's interesting to look at some of the key founding fathers and what they believed in religion. Washington had been raised an Anglican, and but he knew the country had a lot of different religions, and he's worried about religious strife. So he never took communion. He tried to avoid taking communion as an Anglican because he didn't want to be associated as a leader of the new nation with any one denomination. If any of the founding fathers had sort of the old Puritan zealotry, it was probably John Adams. Of course, he's not a Puritan. It's the 18th century, and the Puritan faith had begun to break up. But he was still had of an outsized role in the importance of religion in John Adams' life. At the opposite extreme was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who really adopted deist beliefs, which I talked about last time. Deists didn't believe that, in things like a lot of the liturgy and miracles and stuff like that. And what Jefferson famously did was he thought Christian religion taught good principles, but he didn't believe any of the miracles. And so what he did is he took a Bible and he cut out all of the miracles, which included, of course, Jesus' resurrection. And he included things that were good moral teachings. And this became known as Jefferson's Bible. Like George Washington, Jefferson, of course, worried that the religious differences and religious strife would break the new nation apart. And so he helped write the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was one of the first state documents that stressed that everybody had the right to worship as they pleased. In general, what you can ask yourself, well, what did the founding fathers believe? Did they create a Christian nation? Well, certainly most of them had Christian backgrounds, but most scholars believe today that what they wanted to create was a nation with a civil religion, and that they believed that religion, and specifically Christianity, did teach morals, but they didn't want to get into any specific denomination or any specific aspect or belief system because it would divide the country. And so what they did was they stressed the common morality and civic virtue that was taught in all the religions, and they tended to observe some of these holidays, but they really worried about mentioning a specific god or a specific liturgy from any denomination because they didn't want the country to be associated with any one religion. So no, the United States wasn't founded technically as a Christian nation, but it had certainly Christian overtones. For example, when Washington took the oath of office, he chose to take it with his right hand over a Bible, and a Christian Bible, and that became sort of a precedent, and every president's done likewise since. After the American Revolution, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, they kept the old Congregationalist church as their established church. And I talked about what an establishment meant in the previous video. But nevertheless, after the Revolution, a movement for disestablishment grew. And within years, all 3 states no longer had an established church. Disestablishment came in the southern colonies as well. The Anglican Church had been the official church of places like Virginia, and after the Revolution, of course, they didn't want the Church of England being their official religion. The Church of England, the American Church of England, the American Anglican Church became known as the Episcopal Church, and it was just a branch under the umbrella of the Anglican Church, but it wasn't led directly by the King of England anymore. You can see the civil religion the Founding Fathers wanted to create in the new nation, and in fact, in the Constitution of the United States. Never once in the Constitution did they ever even mention God. Article 6 provided for an oath of office, but no religious test. You did not have to be a member of any one religion or believe in any one belief system to hold office in the new United States. The Founding Fathers did adopt a Bill of Rights that included 10 amendments, and among them were amendments that protected individual liberties, certainly the most important being the First Amendment. The First Amendment included the Establishment Clause, which says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what that meant was, you were not going to have an official church, and no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof is kind of called the Free Exercise Clause. The government would not have an official church. Taxes would not support any one church, and anybody could worship as they please. That was in the First Amendment. Of course, what constitutes free exercise is sort of open to a debate, and the Supreme Court in the coming years would, of course, decide questions over what exactly these clauses mean, as it still does today. It was in the early national period that Thomas Jefferson wrote his famous letter to the Danbury Baptist in 1802. He said he worried that if there was a close alliance between a church and the state, it would hurt both. I mean, if church and state were closer together, then the state would hurt the church. And the church would lead to problems with the state. And so Jefferson in this letter famously said there should be a wall of separation between government and religion, between church and state. Now, of course, as I've already said, the Founding Fathers had different religious beliefs, and while they all kind of worried about religious strife breaking the country apart, and they promoted civil religion for the new country, there were still going to growing political divisions. And here you see an early cartoon depicting political opponents fighting. Invariably, in politics that were developing, there would be religious charges. Here you see like a newspaper article saying that Jefferson believes in no God. John Adams is going to be a religious president, but if you vote for Jefferson, you're voting for no God. I mean, religion was part of the attack politically, and of course, religion still plays a role in the politics we have today. In the early national period, there's going to be a growth of an African-centric church, Christian church. It was founded by Richard Allen, and it's going to combine, because African Americans in slavery had been taught different denominations. It's going to sort of combine some of the beliefs of all these systems for one umbrella for African Americans. Richard Allen's church for African Americans becomes known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or commonly known as the AME Church. So it kind of melds all these Great Awakening faiths that the free blacks and the slaves have been taught in the colonial era. By the early national period, the old deist, it's sort of codified into another religion known as Unitarian religion, Unitarianism. Unitarians rejected the Christian idea of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And they said, like the deists had, from which it grew, that there was one creator of the universe and its laws. And you should use reason to understand the God's laws. So it grew out of the Enlightenment. It was, kind of grew out of deism. Now, in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, the economy boomed in the United States. We're seeing the earliest sort of mechanization, the use of steam power, the first factories, and all of this is going to lower prices, create jobs, and make the economy boom. It's going to transform American society. But it had its downside. Workers in these emergent factories were often treated like part of the machine. It was dull, monotonous work. Now, all of this is going to continue to grow. The Industrial Revolution is going to continue to grow, and it's going to become more profound in the late 19th century. But the Antebellum age, the period before the Civil War, we do see the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, and there were, as I say, negative aspects. It was tough working in these hot, sweaty factories. And the factory workers were poor, they worked long hours, no rules, and they lived close to the factories in the cities, and the cities had all sorts of problems with adequate water and sewage and slums, and their life just kind of sucked. As I've already said, workers are required to work long hours, hard hours, and it's really kind of inhumane. Well, perhaps inevitably, the bad treatment, the early Industrial Revolution, the part you feel like God doesn't care about you. You're just part of a jagged-on operating machine. All the big cities, and I'm a little nobody. I'm just one person. All of that sentiment is going to lead to another religious revivalism, another emotional religious movement taking place, this time in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, and known as the Second Great Awakening. We talked about the Great Awakening in the first video on religion, and now we're talking about the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s, a reaction to the early Industrial Revolution. In the Second Great Awakening, there was less emphasis on punishment, the old fire and brimstone of the First Great Awakening preachers. And there was more emphasis that God loved the common man, and the common man was still important in God's eyes, despite the early Industrial Revolution. Unlike the First Great Awakening, women were a driving force for the Second Great Awakening. But again, there would be these emotional preachers in the back country and what they called camp meetings in the Second Great Awakening, and people would come out from the cities, and there'd be these very emotional revivalist preaching going on. The Second Great Awakening, you're not going to see the creation of a whole lot of new religions, but you are going to see the old light religions like the Catholic and Episcopal Church lose memberships. And still the Catholic and Episcopal churches tended to be the more well-off, but their membership actually dropped. And the Great Awakening faiths, the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians, they grew in the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. Here you can see how a lot of the new Great Awakening's religions grew, but most the Methodists and then followed by the Baptists. Now, another different stressing of the Second Great Awakening from the first was a new wave of evangelism, winning more converts to the Lord and saving more souls. That was certainly part of the First Great Awakening, but now you kind of have more of the Great Commission. Go out, go hither, and bring more people into the fold. The evangelism was really a key part of the Second Great Awakening. Now, I said the Second Great Awakening didn't really create a whole lot of new religions. Well, despite the fact that Christ hadn't returned with the creation of the United States, it did help sort of create the Adventist movement, which declared that Christ's return, his advent, was nevertheless soon. So it's sort of like the old millennialists. That was a kind of help grew out of the Second Great Awakening, the Adventist movement. You get to the 1820s and the 1830s and the 1840s, you're seeing the country grow westward and all the wagon trains and that had religious overtones too, because Americans began to believe in what they termed manifest destiny. It's our destiny, our manifest destiny to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We are a democracy. We are perceiving ourselves as a Christian nation. And God wanted us to spread this from coast to coast. And so you see kind of an angel leading the settlers westward. Manifest destiny definitely had religious overtones. Groups were formed to promote the Bible and spread the Bible, and one of them was the American Tract Society, and they would make sure that people going westward, they had the Bible and they would replicate the old Christian faith. Very evangelical. Now, at this time over in Europe, there was the Irish potato famine. The potato had actually was an American plant that had been brought to the United States, but it had a blight, a disease had destroyed the crop, and people were starving in Ireland. And this is going to lead, of course, to an increase in Ireland. In the middle of the 19th century and into the Antebellum age, Irish immigrants, Irish Catholic immigrants, flooded in. The fact that the new Irish immigrants were Catholic was, of course, key. The nation, the United States, was predominantly Protestant, and these wave of Irish Catholics led to a wave of nativism, and they were depicted as ugly and drunk. The Irish Catholics also tended to stay together to maintain their culture and their Catholic faith, and so they didn't readily assimilate, and that more made people ostracize them. They weren't Protestants, and they clung together, and so there's just, like I say, a wave of nativism. Because they were Catholics, Protestants believed they had to follow the Pope. And you know what's going to happen is the Pope's going to flood, all these Irish Catholics going to flood into America, and then they're all going to vote according to what the Pope says. And so here's a cartoon showing the Pope plotting to take over America. So while the early Industrial Revolution in the first half of the 19th century in America produced both a new religious revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening and a wave of anti-Catholic nativism, it also led to splinter groups, small groups of people who sought to separate themselves from the changing industrial America. Transcendentalism, for one, grew out of Unitarianism, and like the Unitarians, sought to use their logic and reason to find their inner spirituality, their inner goodness. Transcendentalists, however, were more mystical and called for an even greater liberation and imagination to transcend, they said, the modern industrial world. You have the Enlightenment, and the deists were early, and then out of deism grew Unitarianism, and then Transcendentalism is in the same vein. It's much more mystical and looks to nature in a way that reveres it more than the human-made cities and factories. And so, of course, they believe that one way to understand God was to get away from the creations of man, the factories and the cities, and look at what God had created, nature. You can see spirituality in these famous transcendentalist writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Here is a quote saying, "Nature always wears the colors of the spirit." And one of his most famous books was indeed titled Nature. Perhaps the most famous of the transcendentalist writers and thinkers was Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau actually did indeed remove himself from civilized, so quote-unquote, society. He went out to Walden Pond in Massachusetts to think and to write, and he wrote the book Walden, or Life in the Woods. Besides the transcendentalists, who involved a lot of educated writers, they didn't really coordinate so much together other than their writing. You do have groups that physically remove themselves and sort of try to create a separate society. And one of them was the famous Shakers. And here you see a picture of a Shaker commune. Shakers pledged to avoid sin and thus abstain from sex, alcohol, tobacco, politics, and most modern amusements. It was a very spiritual movement. They saw God as a dual person, male and female. And they actually believed that one 19th century woman, Anne Lee, represented God's female side. Jesus Christ represented his male side, and Anne Lee represents God's female side. And Anne Lee, by the way, reportedly performed miracles. While the Shakers abstained from sex, another commune, another separate community, had sort of a different take. The Oneida community believed in multiple marriage, or sort of like communal marriage. That when marriage kind of implies that a woman is owned by a man, God is love, and therefore we all love each other. We have a sort of a communal marriage. No one is married to one person. So the Oneidas kind of, again, address, it's sort of a spiritual movement based in love, and you'd have sex with any number of people in the community, and here you see the Oneida family at dinner. Of course, perhaps the most famous of these religious-based groups that sort of separate themselves from society was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly referred to as the Mormons, founded by Joseph Smith in the early 1800s. He said God had given him tablets. One of the angels, Moroni, had given him tablets, and God, he didn't like the industrial world that was developing, and he wanted Joseph Smith to lead a revival of his followers. And Joseph Smith did as he was told, and they stressed the family, and they stressed positive behavior and righteous traits before God, and the Mormon Church grew tremendously. The problem was that one of God's revelations was the approval of polygamy. A man could have multiple wives, and this sort of alienated them from even more from the rest of American society, and that helped encourage a lot of persecution of the Mormons. The Mormons stressed their community and sort of separated themselves, and when they started adopting polygamy, as I say, the larger American society persecuted them. Here you can see a cartoon of that. Eventually, Joseph Smith's successor, Brigham Young, decided to lead the Mormons out into the wilderness, out to the Great Salt Lake in Utah, where they would establish their own godly society separate. While some sought to separate themselves from the industrial America and form their own godly communities, others used their faith to try to reform America, to change America, to make it more godly and humane. They didn't leave, but they sought to fight to change it. The Second Great Awakening was obviously a motivation for this reform movement, and women were the major reformers of this period. Some continued the idea of what they called the women's sphere. That was areas, women had traditionally been responsible for child raising in the home and instilling virtue in children and so forth. And so some women said that they could do things outside the home, but they should stay in similar types of area, the women's sphere. And so they campaigned against things like immorality, for example, protesting against prostitution at brothels. Others protested against horrible conditions at prisons and hospitals for the mentally ill, known as at the time insane asylums. And still others, of course, are going to begin to protest against slavery itself. And that is where we're going to pick up with the third video and the role of religion in the abolitionist movement. This concludes the second video.